The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Minneapolis Policy and Government Oversight Committee will now begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Lisa Bender. I'm the chair of the Policy and Government Oversight Committee, and I'm going to call to order our regular meeting for today. As we begin, I'll note for the record that this meeting has remote participation by council members and city staff as authorized under the Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared state of local public health emergency. At this time, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll to verify the presence of a quorum.
Councilmember Reich.
Present.
Gordon.
Here.
Fletcher.
Here.
Cunningham.
Present.
Ellison.
Present.
Goodman.
Present.
Cano.
Here.
Schrader.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Palmisano.
Present.
Jenkins.
Here.
President Bender.
Here.
There are 12 members present.
Let the record reflect that we have a quorum. Before we take up the printed agenda, I wanted to note that we have one item to take up today that was continued from last week's meeting but didn't get added to the agenda, and that item is the proposed hiring freeze. I'll recognize the city clerk to give a short explanation of that item.
Thank you, Madam President. As you know, last week the hiring freeze proposal was packaged together with the wage freeze. Those items were separated by the council, and this proposal, the issue of the hiring freeze, was postponed to today's meeting of the Policy and Government Oversight Committee, and notice was given at that time. So the paperwork was not prepared in time to get it on the agenda and postponed to today, my fault. And so given that the council directed it be added to today's agenda, it would be appropriate for the council to then add it to this agenda so that we follow through on that notice and act on that proposal today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. And with that, I will add that item as number 30 on our agenda following the Equity Subcommittee presentation. With that, we'll move to our first order of business, which is public hearings, and we have two public hearings on today's agenda. The first hearing is on the proposed charter amendment, which was submitted to us by the Charter Commission. I'll ask the city clerk to provide a summary of the proposal, and then we'll open the public hearing. Mr. Carl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This proposed amendment, as you noted, was submitted by the Charter Commission on April 2nd to be enacted by ordinance pursuant to Minnesota Statutes Section 410.12, Subdivision 7. That is the statutory provision which authorizes charter amendments by ordinance as an alternative method to referring such proposals to the electorate. The need for this change arises due to a conflict with state election law that prescribes uniform dates for special municipal elections. That state law was enacted in 2017. It's codified under Minnesota Statutes Section 205.10, Subdivision 3A. And under that law, special elections may only be conducted on the second Tuesday in the months of February, April, or May, or in conjunction with the dates for the regular statewide primary in August or the general election in November. A charter may not override those restrictions. These uniform election dates conflict with the city charter's provisions for special elections for the offices of mayor and council member. Under the city charter, if an early vacancy is declared in any of those offices, then a special election must be called by order of the city council and completed within 90 days. Accordingly, and as a result of the recent vacancy in the Ward 6 office, staff requested the Charter Commission to consider this amendment in order to remove the conflict with the new state law. As this body is aware, the Charter Commission was already in the process of considering a separate charter amendment related to elections, and that was about the impact of redistricting for our regular elections cycle. The Charter Commission has decided to submit that amendment to the voters as a ballot question in November. The Charter Commission determined that this proposal, which is related to the timing of special elections, could be addressed by ordinance, and so transmitted its favorable recommendation to the City Council for action. However, amending the charter by ordinance requires the unanimous affirmative vote of the entire fixed membership of the council. That is, it requires 13 affirmative votes for passage and the approval of the mayor. So with the vacancy in Ward 6, it will be impossible to achieve the voting threshold. And that's the highest threshold required for any action of City Council. It reflects the fact that any proposal to amend what is the city's constitution by ordinance, and thereby bypassing the voters, should only be done with the highest voting threshold. And even then, any ordinance which amends the city charter is subject to a 60-day protest petition, during which time a petition can be filed mandating that the matter be referred to voters to decide. Still, the statutory process requires that this action on these proposals be completed in a definite timeline. Therefore, staff proposes that the City Council complete its formal action on this proposed ordinance so that we can close out the file on this particular issue. The City Council may wish to refer this item back to the Charter Commission to have this proposed amendment combined with the other election-related amendments so that all of that could be packaged and submitted to voters in November. And that completes my presentation, Madam Chair. I'm happy to respond to questions the committee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. Are there any questions for the clerk before we open the public hearing? I don't see any. So with that, I will open the public hearing. Do we have anyone signed in to speak?
Madam President, there are no speakers registered for this hearing.
Thank you. And so, Mr. Carl, just to sort of summarize the actions before us today, we can go ahead and move this item, and were it to pass unanimously, we still do not have the full contingent of the council necessary to enact this change. So in that case, we would likely want to consider referring this back to the Charter Commission as you described, because we would have exhausted our authority with only 12 council members to really take that final action.
Correct. And Madam Chair, to add to what you're saying, I briefly referenced there is a statutory timeline prescribed for action. I did look into whether or not we could continue the public hearing long enough until after the special election is concluded and we had a full complement of all council members, all the seats filled. That won't happen until the end of August, and the statutory timeline will not stretch that far.
Great, thank you. So we'll go ahead and close the public hearing officially. I opened it and we didn't have any speakers. I will move to forward this to the full council. And I'd also be happy to recognize Councilmember Ellison, who's our elections chair under normal circumstances, to see if there's anything you want to add, council member, ahead of Friday.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd just like to share with my colleagues that I'll be offering this motion at our meeting on Friday to refer this proposal back to the Charter Commission with the request that it be combined with the other election-related amendment that will be submitted to voters as a question on the November 3rd general election ballot. So we can't take action today, and we need to let this statutory process play out, but wanted to give a heads up to everyone that I plan to bring this motion forward Friday. So thank you.
Thank you, council member. So I've moved that we forward this with recommendation for approval to the City Council, noting those details from the clerk and from Councilmember Ellison. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Reich,
Aye.
Gordon,
Aye.
Fletcher, Councilmember Fletcher,
Aye.
Cunningham,
Aye.
Ellison,
Aye.
Goodman,
Aye.
Cano,
Aye.
Schrader,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Palmisano,
Aye.
Jenkins,
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That carries, and that will be forwarded to the City Council on Friday for the body's recommendation there. The second hearing is for the sale of property located at 2406 McNair Avenue North to Magnolia Homes LLC, subject to conditions. And here to give the staff presentation on this issue is Kevin Knase from the Community Planning and Economic Development Department. Mr. Knase.
Good afternoon, President Bender and council members. I come before you today with a proposal to sell 2406 McNair to Magnolia Homes LLC for $22,300. The lot is a replacement parcel for a land sale that previously was awarded by City Council on February 15, 2019 at 917 31st Avenue North through the Minneapolis Homes Program. It was determined that the lot being replaced was not feasible to be developed as a twin home, and as a result would require the loss of an affordable homeownership unit. As a result, the developer and CBID staff worked to identify a replacement parcel and identified 2406 McNair Avenue North as a replacement parcel to develop a twin home, thus ensuring that 2 affordable homeownership units are able to be created instead of just 1. The developer has met the program requirements and is prepared to complete due diligence and acquire the lot and start construction. Notification was provided to the Northside Residents Redevelopment Council. NERC did express some concerns with there only being 2 owners, that the shared responsibility of common maintenance could be challenging and could negatively impact the neighborhood. The developer was not able to attend today, but did want me to pass along some comments. And the comments are: Magnolia Homes is looking forward to expanding its partnership with the Minneapolis Homes Program in the twin home market. We believe providing homeowners energy efficient housing options below $240,000 is in alignment with the Minneapolis 2040 plan. And with that comment, I've concluded my presentation, and I am happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will proceed to open the public hearing and see if there's anyone on the call to speak on this item.
There are no speakers registered, Madam President.
Thank you. I will go ahead and close the public hearing. Are there any questions or comments from council members? May I have a motion on this item?
So moved.
Second.
Approval of this land sale has been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Reich,
Aye.
Gordon,
Aye.
Fletcher,
Aye.
Cunningham,
Aye.
Ellison,
Aye.
Goodman,
Aye.
Kano,
Aye.
Schrader,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Palmisano,
Aye.
Jenkins,
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That carries, and the sale of that property is recommended for approval at the full council meeting on Friday. That completes the 2 public hearings on the agenda today and brings us to the next order of business, which is the consent agenda. The consent agenda includes items that we did not identify for needing separate discussion, but feel free, any of my colleagues, to note if you'd like to pull any of the items off for discussion, or comments, or questions. There are 26 items on today's consent agenda, which I will read for the record. Item 3 is approving the settlement in the litigation matter of Walter Lewis Franklin II versus Lucas Peterson et al., and authorizing the city attorney's office to execute any necessary documents. This is a slight amendment procedurally to a prior action that was approved by the city council. Item 4 is authorizing a contract in the amount not to exceed $300,000 with Cornerstone Advocacy Service to operate a 48-hour domestic violence crisis hotline. Item 5 is authorizing a pro bono contract with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis for the city's 2040 comprehensive plan, specifically tied to performance against identified housing goals. Item 6 is approving the 2020 Low Barrier Housing Initiative program guidelines and procedures and authorizing the notice of funding availability. Item 7 is approving the 2020 Affordable Housing Trust Fund program policies and procedures and authorizing the notice of funding availability. Item 8 is approving the 2021 Housing Tax Credit Program Qualified Allocation Plan and Procedure Manual. Item 9 is authorizing a 1-year contract extension with FRS Secure LLC for payment card industry data service standards compliance services. Item 10 is passage of a resolution to accept first quarter donations. small donations to the city. Items 11 and 12 are resolutions that amend the 2020 General Appropriation Resolution to approve the rollover of unspent 2019 appropriations from council ward budgets and from the mayor's office, respectively, into the 2020 budget. Item 13 is a resolution that amends the 2020 Health Department budget through a reallocation of funds, including those resolutions in items 11 and 12. Item 14 is acceptance of a state grant for skin lightening outreach and education in the total amount of $90,000 and passage of a resolution appropriating those grant funds to the Health Department. Item 15 authorizes the Health Department to submit a grant application to the Centers for Disease Control for community-based approaches to reducing sexually transmitted diseases for a 3-year period through August of 2023. Item 16 authorizes a contract amendment with One Neck IT Solutions LLC, increasing the total amount to $40,773,000 and an extension through February 28th, 2023 for continued outsourced enterprise IT managed services and authorizing a minimum revenue commitment clause of approximately 60%, which is not to exceed $8.4 million. Item 17 authorizes a contract amendment with Arete Consulting Group for a solid waste information system and extending that contract term through December 31st, 2020. Items 18 through 23 are all contract amendments for work tied to the new public service building project, which are reflected in detail on the agenda. Item 24 authorizes grant acceptance from the Mississippi Watershed Management Organization in the amount of $522,041 for construction of green infrastructure as part of the Hoyer Heights reconstruction project and passage of a resolution to adjust the appropriation and revenue for the Public Works Stormwater Program Fund to reflect those grant funds. Item 25 authorizes a contract amendment with Short Elliott Hendrickson for a revised total amount not to exceed $2,064,070 for additional sanitary and storm manhole inspection services and extending that contract through March 31st, 2021. Item 26 authorizes an amendment to the temporary construction easement agreement with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board for the 10th Avenue Southeast Bridge Rehabilitation Project. Item 27 is passage of a resolution to designate the 2020 alley renovation project for the improvement of 9 alleys and setting of a public hearing on June 10th, 2020. And item 28 is accepting the low bid from Rainbow Inc. in the amount of $269,400 for the 11th Avenue Bridge painting project in accordance with city specifications. Would anyone like to pull any of those items off or comment on any of those items? Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, President Bender. I don't need to pull it out from the consent agenda, but I do want to comment briefly on items 11, 12, and 13. In the sort of finance subcommittee, we looked at all of the rollover items from 2019 to 2020 to see if there are savings that could be identified that could be moved towards the emergency. And one of the things that stood out was our own council ward budgets. And that struck me as an opportunity to sort of set the signal that we are looking much more closely at everybody's budgets and for us to be the first ones to tighten our belts a little bit and kind of start cutting from the top. I spoke with the mayor's office about it to see sort of what the need was around emergency supplies, and they've identified touchless thermometers, cloth masks, which the CDC is now recommending and which we've heard from many, especially people living in low-income multifamily buildings, that there's a real need for masks to be distributed, and hand sanitizer. And the mayor offered, if we were to roll over if we were to not roll over the money, which is what we're doing, to also match that with $10,000 from the mayor's operating budget, which he's paying for with a staff position that went unfilled for a little while. And so together, the mayor's office and the council office are contributing $63,000 through this action that's going to public health that they're using to acquire 15,000 cloth masks and 2,000 bottles of hand sanitizer that they're going to be able to distribute. 3,000 of those masks will go to MPHA residents, and they're being prioritized to low-income multifamily buildings for the rest of the distribution. So I appreciate everybody being willing to look at their own ward budgets and sort of figure out how to make this work, and know this is going to an excellent purpose.
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher, and thank you so much for your efforts in leading on this issue. I think it is really meaningful. Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Councilmember Fletcher, for bringing this proposal forward and demonstrating our commitment to fairness in the process that we go down as we're tightening the belt of the entire city. I'm just curious, you know, if this is coming out of our ward budgets, is there a way that we can brand those masks with a city logo of some sort?
Thanks for the question, Council Vice President. I'm not sure if that is best directed to Councilmember Fletcher or folks from the Health Department, or it's also something we could follow up.
I can answer.
Yeah, please.
So my suspicion is probably not without slowing down the process, and I think it's probably more urgent to get the masks out into the community than to think about modifying their design. But certainly, we do want everybody to know that we're doing our best to get masks out. We're certainly not the only ones doing it either, and there's going to be a lot circulating there. But I know time is of the essence here, right? We're trying to prevent the spread, and I think at least one of the manufacturers that I spoke with when we were trying to source this had is using existing materials that they had in their in their facility, so they're not going to be consistently branded or consistently using the same materials.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I've noticed other cities across the country have branded masks that they are distributing to the community. It would be really great if we could do the same, but I do understand the urgency. But this may not be our last time doing this, so we should think about that for the future.
Thank you. Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam President, and thanks goes to the Councilmember Fletcher and the finance team, finding a very direct source for a very direct need. I couldn't think of a better application of a limited resource for a very important local need that no one else seems to be filling. So I'm just really appreciate the target of the dollars, let alone the work that went to locate them. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Reich. Is there any further discussion or comment on this item or the other items on the consent agenda? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda items?
So moved.
Second.
Has been moved and seconded. Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Reich,
Aye.
Gordon,
Aye.
Fletcher, Cunningham,
Aye.
Ellison,
Aye.
Goodman,
Aye.
Cano,
Aye.
Schrader,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Palmisano,
Aye.
Jenkins,
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
That carries and the consent agenda is adopted. That brings us to our equity subcommittee, and I'll turn that over to Subcommittee Chair, Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Equity Subcommittee is pleased to welcome the team from our Race Equity Division in the City Coordinator's Office to provide us with a report on their work in response to the COVID-19 local health emergency. And I will just say that it has been really rewarding to see how the Division of Race and Equity is reaching out to various communities and providing resources, providing support during this pandemic. So here to present the report is our Race and Equity Division Director, Ms. Joy Marsh Stevens.
Good afternoon. Just a quick question about this. Thank you. Just a quick question about the slides. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the introduction, Council Vice President Jenkins. As you mentioned, the purpose of our presentation is to highlight some of the efforts that are underway in the Division of Race and Equity in response both to the immediate needs that are arising in the pandemic, as well as looking forward into the horizon, ensuring that the decisions that we're making today don't further exacerbate the inequities that we are experiencing within our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. More than 100 million people nationwide, most of whom are from BIPOC communities, struggled to make ends meet prior to the pandemic, and the emergency that's being triggered by COVID-19 is really laying to bear some of the structural failures of this economy. And while we don't, as the city of Minneapolis, have the capacity as an institution to heal all that is broken, we certainly can ensure that the decisions that we make today in response to those immediate needs keep the future in mind, so that we are reducing human suffering and lessening some of the inequities. So in order to accomplish this goal, we all have to work together to be committed unequivocally to meeting the express needs and priorities of our communities that are in greatest need. The presentation today is structured around Policy Link's Street Smart Recovery Principles. These are the 5 principles that are on the screen right now. They're reminding us to center racial equity, to put people first, to invest in into the community infrastructure, building an equitable economy, and protecting and expanding community voice and power. I'll use this framing to, again, highlight some of the work that we're doing within our division, as well as call some examples from other work that might be happening in other departments in the city, some of which we're engaged in, some of which we're not engaged in, but really just using this as an overarching principle and frame for the presentation. I also want to name that these 5 principles from Policy Link aren't meant to be taken in any sort of sequential order. They really are very highly complementary to each other. And if people have questions or are interested in more information about these principles, I'm happy to share that outside of this meeting. The next slide, please. So looking at centering racial equity for us, I'm going to compartmentalize this into 4 key areas that are pretty much work that is driven specifically from our office, some of it in relationship with others. The first being the COVID-19 racial equity impact analysis. As many of you are aware, we were just at the precipice of really institutionalizing the racial equity impact analysis, our standard racial equity impact analysis, at the time in which the stay-at-home order came out from the governor, and people really began to focus much more heavily on COVID-19. So one of the primary efforts that we took as a division was restructuring that racial equity impact analysis and making it more streamlined. So elevating some of the questioning to 3 core questions inside of the COVID-19 racial equity impact analysis, with the intention that staff across the city would use that tool as a way to help them in a much quicker decision-making process, still make sure that they're centering racial equity by asking 3 core questions: who's going to benefit, who's going to be harmed, really what is the goal that we're trying to accomplish, and essentially wanting to make sure that, again, we're taking the time to ask those questions. It can become pretty easy in an emergency situation to make decisions in a rapid pace, and we wanted to ensure that we were giving staff the tools that they needed in order to help make sure that they could take that pause. So this tool, along with other supports that my division has created, are part of a SharePoint site that we've also communicated to staff and have been working with the clerk's office to make sure that that resource is embedded and available in the legislative information management system so that it's readily available to staff. As a complement to that is the standard racial equity impact analysis tool that we began talking about back in January. We had our last update on the strategic and racial equity action plan. That tool is also available in LIMS. We have built out a series of training and other sorts of supports to help staff understand how to use the tool and how to follow the process in their work. That process is the one that is built specifically into the legislative process as part of the SREEP adoption by council back in actually technically in December of 2018, but formally ratified in July of 2019. The SREEP, or the racial equity impact analysis process, is standardized. It's inside the legislative information management system, and it's available to staff to begin using right away. The third piece of it is the work that we've been doing with our strategic and racial equity action plan. We had intended today actually to present our update for Q1 on status for the sweep, but because all of our efforts have been so heavily focused on the COVID response as a city, we decided to push that update out into July of this year, and so combining a Q1 and Q2 update in July according to the standard schedule that we had set earlier this year. At the same time, we continue to support departments in moving forward and accomplishing their goals tied to the Strategic and Racial Equity Action Plan. As I mentioned before, the COVID-19 as not just a public health crisis for us actually is a significant racial equity crisis for us as a city, as well as we're seeing people across the world, particularly within the United States, people of color, Black people in particular, really being much more heavily impacted by COVID-19 from a social and economic perspective. And so it's all the more pressing that we are continuing to maintain our focus on the goals that we set both inside of the SREEP as well as other racial equity goals that we're setting as a jurisdiction. The last piece I'll mention that I already kind of spoke to a little bit was the technical assistance and training. We've developed three online training courses for staff on the racial equity impact analysis process. We also have ongoing monthly sessions available to staff to help them understand how the process works and to provide supports to them. I referenced the SharePoint site earlier. That we continue to build out that site with other resources and supports for staff to be able to both understand how to follow the process as well as knowing who to contact in the Division of Race and Equity if they have any questions. Putting people first. So in this work, it really is about how are we making sure that we are addressing putting the faces on the COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic, recognizing that there are immediate needs that people have in this moment, and lots of work is happening across the city. I'm just going to speak to those pieces that we are doing within our division. The primary effort that we've done is our COVID-19 Emergency Mental Health Fund. As Council is aware, we have a grant that we facilitate through the Division of Race and Equity. It's a federal grant that looks at mental health, resilience in communities. And so we took $200,000 from that fund and made it available to community-based mental health and behavioral health providers, be they either licensed or those who work in practice in a more culturally or traditionally specific way. Made these resources available to them to be able to provide services to residents in the city of Minneapolis, primarily through a virtual delivery format, sometimes working with existing clients, other times working with expanding that to a broader footprint and bringing in new clientele. So through 3 rounds of funding, we were able to score 89 proposals, fund 29 of those proposals, and working with organizations to get to work pretty quickly with the idea that they're able to turn their projects around, ramp up within a week of being funded, and complete their projects within 90 days. At this point, all of the organizations, I believe, have been formally contracted through a procurement process and are actively working. In addition to that, recognizing that there are populations in our community who are not currently eligible to receive funding through the federal government stimulus package, we've also been working, we were invited in to collaborate with our human trafficking fellow in the coordinator's office and help to develop a fund that allows for more direct needs to be provided to individuals who fall into these categories who are, again, not eligible to receive some of the federal funding. So we're just collaborating on that effort, providing some technical assistance there, largely based on our own experience doing funds like our Emergency Mental Health Fund and some of the contracting around grant funding. So excited to see that work move forward. That will likely be working through an outside community-based organization to actually deliver those funds directly to those residents who qualify. The third piece of it from a communications perspective, we've already been in the habit of providing a biweekly newsletter out of our division. We added an additional newsletter, so on alternate newsletter weeks, we provide a specific newsletter that provides resources to community members on COVID-19 resources. Oftentimes we're amplifying other work that's happening inside of the city, as well as adding other resources that we're finding through our own both local and national networks. The last piece here around putting people first is the collaboration that we've been doing from largely the very beginning with the health department. We were invited in to work with them and their incident management team, specifically looking at community engagement. So helping to add to the list of communities that they are including, helping with their shared powers team to both develop and to facilitate those meetings with that group as well. The last piece around investing in community infrastructure really speaks to that the recognition that our nonprofit and our community-based organizations really are the ones who are on, like many aspects of us in the city, are really on the front lines, often doing less with, or needing to do more with less and less resources in this time. So this principle from Policy Link is just reminding us within jurisdictions to be thinking about how we're growing that capacity of our community-based organizations to do work. So I just offer here an example that the health department's work around collecting, for example, personal protective equipment and making those resources available. Certainly the piece that that council just talked through on the consent agenda around pooling your own resources and making masks available to MPHA properties, like that's another example of the types of investments that we as jurisdiction should be making in order to help strengthen our community infrastructure. This piece around building an equitable economy is pretty expansive. So this is really about how are we actually thinking ahead and recognizing the economic toll that COVID-19 is playing both on us today, but then also thinking into the future. As I mentioned at the beginning, certainly the challenges that we're facing as the city of Minneapolis, both as an institution as well as the constituents that we serve, are far bigger than we as an institution have the ability to solve for. And so all the more reason to be thoughtful and planful in the limited resources that we have to make sure that we are also thinking about where we're going to have the longest term impact, since in our BIPOC communities, we're going to be feeling COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 for many, many years after the public health crisis ends. So one of the key areas to be thinking about in that regard is equitable recovery planning. I am aware that there's recovery planning happening in different pockets of the city. Our encouragement from the Division of Race and Equity is really making sure that we're taking practical steps to be thoughtfully thinking about racial equity and the impact of racial equity and our opportunities to rebuild an economy in the city of Minneapolis that does not put back in pieces that were causing harm in the past. Certainly we know that the disparities exist inside of the city of Minneapolis and have for a long time, which is why as a city we have a definition of racial equity that was adopted back in 2014 in an establishment of a Division of Race and Equity in 2017, followed by the adoption of a SREEP in 2019. These are the critical steps that we've taken as a jurisdiction to name and center racial equity. And so all the more reason for us, an opportunity for us in our recovery planning to make sure that that recovery planning, again, does not put back in pieces that were broken and that were causing harm.
Excuse me, Ms. Marsh-Stevens.
Yes.
We have a question or a comment from Council Member Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Marsh-Stevens, for this update. I really appreciate this Policy Link framework. It really helps to center the conversation in a very common sense kind of way. And so around creating an equitable recovery plan, you said that you're aware of various pockets happening throughout the city. As the director of this division, do you have a recommendation around there being a centralized planning process rather than having it decentralized so that there is more cohesion around the implementation of racial equity?
Chair Jenkins, Councilmember Cunningham, my short answer is yes. I would believe that there is value in us having a strategic, cohesive approach to recovery planning for COVID-19. I've seen that model happen in other jurisdictions and believe that a more strategic and cohesive approach would be of value to us in the city of Minneapolis. And I don't mean more in the sense of better than what we have. I have very limited visibility into what's happening around recovery planning, so I don't know that it isn't strategic. I'm just naming the value of a strategic, cohesive approach.
Great, thank you for that additional information.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that great question, Councilmember Cunningham. And that is something that we can definitely look into in developing as these recovery plans continue. In my awareness, there have been just some very preliminary discussions up to this point, and so there's still opportunity for us to try and centralize that. You can continue with your report, Ms. Marsh-Stevens.
Thank you, Chair Jenkins. The other piece I will offer as it relates to recovery planning, as we center racial equity, in as much as we are able to, making sure that we are including the voices of those who are most impacted by whatever policy decisions we're making, even as we think about recovery. If we're thinking about, I know some conversations that I've had with Council Vice President Jenkins, for example, around the Black community and recognizing we're seeing the impact of COVID-19 nationally, disproportionately impacting the Black community. And so as there's interest within community to begin to organize within the Black community to begin organizing and thinking about how we're recovering, like these sorts of opportunities that we should be as a city really amplifying and encouraging those sorts of tables that have the people who are most impacted at them and helping provide us with that critical thought partnership and moving a more equitable plan forward. The other piece I'll offer here, which is work that we've begun doing with the Office of Emergency Management. It's very much in early days since a lot of the focus is on the immediate crisis. But the Office of Emergency Management is slated to update their emergency operations plan in 2020 and has invited us in to help make sure that the language inside of that plan does center more closely racial equity and opportunities to support the needs of vulnerable populations. So in anticipation of that work, we've begun doing some research with some of our national partners within the Government Alliance and Race and Equity Network to find where there are examples of operations plans that actually do center racial equity. There aren't very many of them from which to draw. So Minneapolis is, as usual, on the forefront of pushing for things like this. And so we will have ideally an example so we can share with others.
Ms. Marsh-Stevens, excuse me for a moment. We have a question or a comment from Council President Bender.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. I put myself in queue a little earlier, but I just wanted to echo that. I think, as you and Ms. Marsh-Stevens mentioned, I think right now the recovery response is sort of part of a continuum of conversations that are happening that are also including the crisis response. And I agree that starting to pull those apart a little bit and to create some spaces that are specifically focused on recovery planning is a great idea. And those conversations are happening in lots of different ways, but creating a more intentional, I think, approach to that, even medium or even short, and medium term recovery planning that's a bit separate from the crisis response, I think will help us, really continue to highlight these core commitments to race equity. So thanks to both of you for really highlighting that and the nuance of that piece.
Agreed. Did you have a response, Ms. Marsh-Stevens, or you can just go ahead and keep moving with your report?
Thank you, Chair Jenkins. The last piece I'll raise on this page is around the cross-jurisdictional collaboration. I mentioned some of that. I spoke to a little bit of that around the emergency operations plan as I referenced our relationship with the Government Alliance and Race and Equity, or with the GARE network. At the very beginning of the COVID-19 really impact here for us locally, we did a lot of, within our division, a lot of reach out to our counterparts within the GARE network. And in doing that cross-jurisdictional collaboration, played a very formative role in building out within the GARE network a COVID rapid response working group that meets on a weekly basis, have pulled in some staff from other parts of the city of Minneapolis who participate on those calls as they have opportunity to do so, as well as being able to leverage the online member collaboration board to share ideas and to also get feedback on some of the things that we are doing here in the city. That cross-jurisdictional collaboration has allowed us the opportunity to also influence other jurisdictions in creating a racial equity impact analysis tool that they're able to use within their existing COVID-19 response work, as well as providing opportunities for us to learn from other examples, both around emergency operations planning, as well as recovery planning, particularly for those cities that are more coastal, that have have had a lot more time to address the COVID-19 pandemic than we have. The last piece around, or this piece here on protecting and expanding community voice and power is, just really reinforcing the work that our city is already doing around making sure that we are expanding access to voting, that we are making sure that everyone counts. It's work that we already, as a city, have already been committed to. Our work in supporting the census has been in supporting efforts around community engagement. With regard to redistricting, we were invited by the clerk's office to collaborate early in helping to shape some capacity building specifically for individuals who are working on actually doing the redistricting mapping and helping to grow their capacity to actually understand the impacts to cultural communities and that work that they're doing. And so planning some of that work and building out some of that model has been our efforts there. And so definitely encouraging the city, as we already have been doing a really good job of supporting these sorts of efforts and communicating the value that even in the midst of our COVID-19 crisis, that we're still committed to making sure that everyone is being counted and supporting right now some of the early work around redistricting. And I believe that is my last slide, unless there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Marsh-Stevens, and thanks to the entire team for this really incredible work that you are helping to lead as our community continues to respond to this pandemic. I do want to just note that, you know, we are very fortunate here in Minneapolis to have Ms. Joy Marsh-Stevens, who is a leader nationally in race and equity work and has been recognized. She's a part of a fellowship that she referenced earlier of 10 cities with 10 directors that meet on a weekly or monthly basis. We were scheduled to be attend the GARE gathering this month, but you know, with the travel restrictions, we had to cancel, but we had been selected to present at that conference. And, you know, and I suspect that when we do get back to some level of normalcy, that we will be in good position to continue to have a national impact as well. Are there any questions from council members? Any additional questions? I see Council Member Cunningham in queue.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I wanted to follow up with the protecting and expanding community voice and power frame. I know that there's been work that's happening, that was already happening. My question is, how are we thinking about expanding engagement virtually? Because not everybody has access, or folks access different platforms. So while we have shelter in place and physical distancing, how are we thinking about adapting our community engagement within these parameters in a way that still is culturally responsive and centering racial equity?
Chair Jenkins, Councilman Cunningham, I'm not sure if that question is related to me specifically for what it is that I am doing within our division. I know that our city, or that our Neighborhood and Community Relations Department has done a really great job of working across the city enterprise to put together a virtual engagement guidance document for us and providing some best practices for city staff and helping us to understand how best to engage with community members in a virtual format. We provided some insight to help to shape some of that and are really grateful to be part of that group think. And we're also being very thoughtful within our work of how to make sure that our engagement efforts are as collaborative and as open as they can be. For example, even with our COVID-19 mental health emergency mental health fund, we recognize that while we wanted to make services available broadly to community members, for many they were experiencing the challenge of a digital divide. They didn't have access to the sort of technology that enabled them to even participate in the sorts of services that we know that people wanted. So this is a very real challenge for us to be thinking about for the communities that we serve, recognizing that we want to expand access and the need to be very creative and how best to do that, because there are those sometimes technical and financial constraints being placed on the very communities that we want to make sure that we're engaging.
Yep, you answered my question. Thank you.
Oh, great.
And, you know, I would add to that. I've been working with Department of Health, and they created a shared power advisory committee that's made up primarily of community members from multiple ethnic communities to really think about and advise the health department on issues that are going on in those respective communities. The Asian American community, the LGBT community is represented, as well as other communities of color, Latinx and African American, East African. And so that is, making use of the technology that we have all been using, but also making those conversations available for folks if they don't have Skype or Zoom or whatever the application is that we're using. People can generally call into those meetings and have involvement and participation that way. So it's an ongoing process to really figure out how best to do the community engagement. But I will, as Ms. Marsh Stevens said, give a shout out to the NCR and neighborhood community relations, that they've been doing a really great job at trying to create access and community engagement during this crisis. So if there are no further questions or comments, I will direct the clerk to receive and file this report. And seeing that there is no further business before this subcommittee today, I will turn the meeting back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much to you, Vice President Jenkins and Ms. Joy-Marsh Stevens, for that presentation. That brings us to our last item on the agenda, which we added at the beginning of the meeting. This is item number 30, and it's related to the proposed hiring freeze. This was already originally before us last week, brought together with the wage freeze resolution, and we split it from that item and postponed it to today's meeting. So I will recognize the city coordinator to give us a brief description of this. Mr. Ruff.
Thank you, President Bender, members of the committee. I'm Mark Ruff, the city coordinator. I think we as staff took to heart the discussion among the council last week on this topic and took the comments in specific around what happened in 2008 to 2013 during the last hiring freeze for the enterprise to heart, in which there was concern expressed by many of you on the council and many within department heads who were in the enterprise at that time about the lack of transparency and the length of that hiring freeze, and also a questioning how financially effective it was, given the fact that there were a number of exemptions that were granted during that time. And that's not a criticism of those involved at that time. It's just a learning from the past and how you as the council have expectations of us as staff around transparency and process. So with that in mind, we came back as staff to provide another alternative for council, and specifically in light of our financial situation today, which is one of the reasons for a hiring freeze that was implemented by the mayor and that you all are considering now as a legislative body. It was because we do have dramatically falling revenues, and during that time of uncertainty, it's reasonable to put as many limitations on expenditures until at least we have a better understanding of what the remainder of the year is going to hold and how that reality is going to translate into financial performance for the enterprise. And so number one is the issue of when will we have a better sense of that reality, and our proposal back to the mayor and the council as staff is to have the mayor proposed and council adopt a new budget for 2020, would essentially be an amended budget that would be considered by council in June. That amended budget then would set new parameters for expenditures by department for the remainder of the year. At that time, we would expect then some predictability then on expenditures, and we would go back to we would remove the hiring freeze and go back to the situation that we have every January 1, when we have said to department leaders, this is your new expenditure limitation, provide the services that are expected of you as staff to our residents, and report back regularly to council on that performance. And so that would be a short-term hiring freeze then, essentially until that budget is adopted in June of 2020. Meanwhile, we will be working obviously with the mayor and the council during the remainder of 2020 for the 2021 budget. And there's no promise that expenditures will be less restrictive in 2021 than they are in 2020. None of us knows what the tails of this pandemic mean for expenditures and the economy as a whole. So I think the natural, me as a department head, I can speak only for myself, but think it would be more universal, is the natural inclination is I will impose my own hiring restrictions within a department just over the concerns about 2021 budget being more restrictive, and wouldn't really want to hire a number of people and then immediately have to reduce that workforce because of restrictions in 2021. So I think there is a natural disincentive for significantly increasing employment between now and the end of 2020. So that is the nature of the hiring freeze, is the transparency, is the budget process, and the fact that we then don't have to live perpetually in uncertainty as department leaders every week or month for the remainder of 2020, but that we set clearly the expectations for departments, and that those expectations are set by you as the elected officials. Between now and when that budget would take effect, as we've moved out of some of the crisis mode where the mayor has made these emergency regulations, we would propose then that the staff committee recommendations continue as were set up in the RCA, and that those recommendations would be reviewed by both the mayor and the council president, and then the council president and the mayor would report out those to the whole council through the executive committee. And so that structure then would be a voice from the council and from the mayor that would be able to give clear direction to the staff committee. But again, that would be a short-term in nature. We are talking about a matter of weeks for the remainder of the hiring freeze. So with that, Madam President, certainly happy to answer any questions or give any clarification.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. I have a couple of colleagues in queue, but first I wanted to just note for my colleagues that Mr. Carl sent a resolution to everyone both yesterday and then again today via email, which has a resolution that captures the proposal from staff that Mr. Ruff just described. And I will describe that a little bit more in detail for the benefit of the public, because it wasn't included in our agenda. And then I just also wanted to ask a quick follow-up question to you, Mr. Ruff, or staff. Could you give a sense to my colleagues and for the public of what the scale or scope of that interim period looks like in terms of the number of requests that have been received and the kind of volume of requests for exemptions to the hiring freeze, and sort of any detail you can give to give us a sense of what kinds of decisions would be made in that interim period?
Sure, Madam President. I'm on the meeting with us today is Patience Ferguson, our Chief Human Resources Officer, and one of her directors, Bill Champa, who has been with the city for many, many years and has a great depth of knowledge. I would ask them both to describe what that specific question about the number of requests, and also to highlight the guidelines that are in the resolution that we are also asking for some comments from council on, because it's those guidelines that have been giving the parameters to us as staff as to what positions would meet an exemption process and what wouldn't. So I'll turn it over to Patience and to Bill.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the POGO committee. I'm going to defer to Bill Champa, who's Director of HR Business Partner Solutions, to give a brief overview of the guidelines. He can also share, he or I could also share what the status is of the request we have so far. So I will turn that over to Bill Champa.
Thank you, CHRO Ferguson, Council President Bender, members of council. I'll try to give a real high level overview of the current process and the guidelines, which are also what we're suggesting as possible guidelines to consider moving forward. Currently, there is a initial review team that is accepting requests from staff. Department head requests for any hiring freeze waiver. And that is comes through my office, through Deb Kruger, a manager in my office who accepts that. And we review that and have an initial review committee with the budget office and with the member from the coordinator's office. That information's then passed on to the decision-making team, which is City Coordinator Mark Ruff, CHRO Patience Ferguson, and interim CFO Lori Johnson. And then all decisions currently filter up to the mayor. We're applying criteria in our process, in our procedures, guidelines that really look at, I would identify 4 big buckets. And the criteria, which we think is very rigorous and much more rigorous than I think we've had in the past. We're looking at the essential need to fill a vacancy. So we're looking at, is the position a first responder? Is it an emergency worker? Is it a position that's providing a critical city service? Specifically, we're looking to the Department of Homeland Security's guidelines on what they consider critical services, and that was also outlined in Governor Walz's original stay-at-home order. We look at legal mandates. We're looking at then financial implications of the position. Is it a budgeted position? Can we afford it? Can we backfill it in another way? What the department's plan to realize personnel costs. So we're reaching back out to departments and asking for a lot more additional information. We're also looking at, are there alternative internal ways to provide that service through other personnel, through other creative ways? We're exploring that. And then finally, we're looking at risk and liability to the city in leaving a position vacant. So that's the criteria piece that we are looking at in terms of numbers, and I'll provide a high level. When we implemented the hiring freeze on March 31st, there were 100 positions in flight. And by that, I mean there were 100 positions that were out there, either accepting application, open for application, or in some part of a hiring process. So there were those 100 positions. The waiver, the hiring freeze waiver process went into effect March 31st. Since that time, we've had 30 waiver requests that have been submitted. Of those 30, 10 have been approved, 3 have been denied, and 17 are in process of a review. So I hope that answers some of your questions. I can hope I covered what you're asking, and I'm certainly willing to take additional questions.
Thank you, Mr. Champa. And I'll just note for my colleagues, not by way of complaint, just by way of transparency, that I have not been involved, nor has the council been involved so far in that process. But part of this resolution today would be to change that to include representation from the City Council. Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Madam President. My comment or request is not to the specifics of the information today, but more on the theme or the topic. And I was having a conversation yesterday with one of our community partners, and they raised a very good question about what sort of learning are we as the current governing body doing on the last recession that the city of Minneapolis had to go through, and sort of learning about the types of decisions that the city made at that time, reviewing sort of the pros and cons of those decisions, and sort of looking back and just seeing if some of those decisions would be made again in the future or not. And so the suggestion was really more about, you know, can city staff prepare for us some sort of presentation where we can walk through some of that information, some of those, I don't want to call them best practices, but just like the knowledge, the institutional knowledge that we as a city have for how we have gotten through moments like this, and then probably have an opportunity to talk about the differences in the two recessions. And then also introduce the tool of racial equity decision making. I'm not sure what kind of lenses were used to make decisions on the budget in the previous recession. But I think it would be really helpful for especially those of us council members who were not a part of the council at that time, 2007, 2008, 2009, that kind of time frame, to get information from staff and other leaders, other city leaders who have that, who have access to that time frame, so that we can learn from that and think about the differences, the similarities, the impact of some of those decisions, long-term, short-term, and just give us a little bit more depth as we enter a decision-making stage of a June budget, you know, an amended budget. So I know that I would really appreciate that, and I'm not quite sure how we package it, but I did want to share that I felt like that was a really good recommendation that one of the community partners I was speaking to yesterday recommended as we were doing a general check-in on how things were going. So I'll just leave that on the table and hope that we can work on this offline. But thank you all for the information so far.
Thank you very much. And in fact, only 3 council members were in office at the time of the last recession out of the 14 elected officials in office now. So I think that is a great perspective and point. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, President Bender. I just wanted to weigh in a little bit because I brought this up last meeting. I had an opportunity to talk to Mr. Ruff about this, and I think it's a creative and useful solution that they've come up with in terms of actually redoing the budget instead of some kind of extended hiring freeze. And I find the inclusion of a council president and the mayor to be together in kind of an advisory capacity, and then the executive committee touching touching these things as they all go forward and getting a report that will be open to the public and everybody can see it. To address my concerns, and I'm comfortable moving forward. I do think it's going to be challenging for us to do all our budget amendments in June, but I think we're up to the task if we really try. So I'm happy to move this forward, but I'm also happy to wait if you think this is the wrong time.
No, thank you, Councilmember Gordon. Councilmember Gordon has moved the item. Is there a second?
Second.
The item has been moved and seconded. Is there any other discussions or comments or questions from council members? I don't see any. Before calling the roll, I'll just thank very much the staff who worked on this, who are also part of that crisis response team as well. And I really appreciate the commitment to doing all of the work that will be needed to bring forward an amended 2020 budget. But I do think it is the best way for us to come together as policymakers and really make those tough trade-off decisions and really focus in on some of the values that Councilor Cano just raised and that were really highlighted in the presentation that Council Vice President chaired related to race equity. So I think, you know, like I said, it'll be difficult decisions, but I think that is the right role for us to play as policymakers in setting that policy level direction for the budget. So really appreciate the staff being willing to do all of the work that will go into that budget amendment process in a truncated timeline, and all of our commitment to make sure that that's transparent and that we are able to collect and invite the input that we will need from our community to make those decisions. So with that, Mr. Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Reich.
Aye.
Gordon.
Aye.
Fletcher.
Aye.
Cunningham.
Aye.
Ellison.
Aye.
Goodman.
Aye.
Cano.
Aye.
Schrader.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Palmisano.
Aye.
Jenkins.
Aye.
President Bender.
Aye.
There are 12 ayes.
Thank you, Madam Clerk, and thank you. That carries and has been forwarded to the City Council for Friday. With that, we've concluded all of our business before our committee today. So without objection, we will stand adjourned. Thank you all so much.